all here to learn about Wolverines. So I'm going to turn it over to John, and he's going to kick off the Wolverine portion of the evening.
Well, welcome everyone. It's really fitting tonight that the Trappers Association is sponsoring this event, because that's kind of how I met Jake. Bill Abercrombie, we were doing some Wolverine research, and Bill promised and delivered 50 beaver carcasses for our project, and they're in the Boston Pizza. We handed over the parking lot of the Boston Pizza. We were moving these beaver carcasses over, and as part of that research, as it evolved, I was able to meet tonight's speaker. And Dr. Jason Fisher is a wildlife ecologist specializing in landscape and climate change on mammals. He currently heads the Applied Conservation Macroecology Lab at the University of Victoria. Formerly, he was the senior research scientist at the Alberta Research Council, big game wildlife biologist with Newfoundland and Labrador's Wildlife Division. He had the dubious honor of being the past president of the Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society. And Jason, along with his colleagues and teammates, have cumulatively published over 54 papers in scientific journals on topics ranging from marine fishes to grizzly bears. In addition to these scientific publications, his work has been featured on TV and radio, news media, textbooks, and we're still waiting for the feature film. He's supervised and mentored numerous grad students and undergrad students, and he's been researching Wolverines since 2003. And he admittedly says that in the early days, there was mixed success, but as he started collaborating with more and more people, the success increased. And since those early days, he's become a leading contributor to Wolverine and mustelid research in North America. I know Jake to be an inquisitive and creative scientist. He's a family man. He's a colleague and a friend, and I'm very glad you could join us tonight here. Everyone, Dr. Jason Fisher.
John, thank you so much for those completely fictitious and kind words. And thanks so much to both of you for the invitation to come and talk about my favorite topic on the planet, bar none, which is Wolverines. John, Sarah, you're gonna have to allow me to share screen, because this is a PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, so sorry. I thought I did that already. You should be able to start now, Jake.
Okay, trying.
There we go.
Got me?
Yeah, I'm looking at your PowerPoint screen. Now I'm looking at the slide.
Awesome. Full meal deal.
Take it away.
All right. I love Wolverines. I love Wolverine science. As John said, I've been doing this since 2003 in collaboration with various folks through the years. That collaboration has built. And today, I have a tremendous opportunity to stand on the shoulders of giants. And I'm going to pull all of you up here with me to enjoy this wonderful view. Because for the last year, a score of colleagues and I have taken a deep dive, a journey, if you will, into the science of Wolverine ecology and conservation. Sponsored by the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, we got together and we plowed through over 150 Wolverine papers, everything that we could find that's been published in the last 20 years, and synthesized them together. And our objective here is to get a fulsome picture of the science behind Wolverines so we can understand what we know, what remains myth and legend, and what more we need to know so we can effectively conserve this enigmatic and beautiful creature. I'm going to start you on this journey in my footsteps on this road with the first Wolverine I ever heard. And it's right in that pile of bushes. So can you see it? I never saw it. I saw this set of Wolverine tracks on a mountain trail as I was skidooing along, and I saw that the tracks came towards me and then veered suddenly off the road, and I realized that Wolverine just left the road because of me, because of my skidoo in this early morning. And so I got off my skidoo and I followed the Wolverine tracks off the road downwards into a whole bunch of thick tuckamore, and eventually across this river and into some more shrubs when I caught up with it. And it was about 15 feet away from me, and I couldn't see it because that bush was so dense. But what I saw was that bush shaking and making the most horrific sound that you could possibly imagine. And I was thrilled and delighted. And then that part of your mind kicks in that says, you probably shouldn't be here hanging out 15 feet from a wolverine that's obviously very scared. And so I backed off, and the wolverine made its way, still unseen, off into the woods and disappeared, hopefully into a new and better life. And I knew in that moment I needed to find out more about this amazing disappearing creature. And I had that opportunity in 2003 as a budding young scientist working for the Alberta Research Council, and the opportunity to go out and work in Western Alberta to learn a few things about wolverines there. We knew that we had them. There hadn't been a lot of research done on wolverines at that time, and so we thought, well, let's go out and see what we can learn using some new technologies. My wife maintains to this very day that I only did it so I had the chance to go and skidoo around the mountains of Alberta. She's probably half right. But while we were having fun out there, we did manage to put out some, what was then new technology, which was some non-invasive DNA sample traps, which were modeled after the wire corrals that we use for grizzly bears today. So put up a bunch of strands of barbed wire and throw some bait in the middle. And one of the local trappers, Ernie, came out and gave us tips, which was mostly him crossing his arms and shaking his head and saying, that ain't gonna work. And hey, you know what? Ernie was right. It didn't work. So here's the evidence of that. Here's the corral, and then these are wolverine tracks going around. Wolverine circled it a bunch of times, said, no, and then booked it. Had very limited success with these wire corrals. And we realized we probably had to give this very smart, intelligent creature some sort of reward for engaging with this very dubious human-smelling thing. And so, again, thanks to the generosity of local trappers and the ATA, we got a pile of frozen beavers, which we then chopped up, and provided we could keep them out of the mouth of our field techs on the road. We hammered them up to a tree, and thus was born this sampling design. And ta-da! This is the very first wolverine that we got with this new hair and infrared camera technology. And an interesting side note, you know, there is very little known about wolverines, so much so that when I pulled this photo into PowerPoint, Microsoft's image recognition gave it the alt text at the bottom of a bear playing with a frisbee in the woods. So that's my new nickname for wolverines, bear with a frisbee in the woods. So we got wolverines, and we haven't stopped. And so consequently, using this technology, new technology in DNA and cameras, in satellite telemetry, advances in DNA analysis, etc., through a whole bunch of modalities, wolverine research has burgeoned over the last 2 decades. In 20 years, our search dug up 156 research papers, which I really have to give a ding ding, because that is a pile of work. And these span the globe, all the way from Russia, China, Mongolia, Fennoscandia, into the United States and Canada. So it's been a lot of work done in that time to understand wolverines, their biology, their ecology, and their conservation. Our goal here was to try to identify research gaps. So first of all, to synthesize what we know, so we could arm governments with that knowledge and empower them to make some good decisions to conserve wolverine. But also to identify the gaps. But as you know, turning research into real change, it's an increasingly difficult task, and oftentimes you end up flat on your back with your legs up in the air when you try hard not to slip. And such is the case in the US. So recently the wolverine was petitioned to be listed under the Endangered Species Act, and was denied. Is that advancing, Sarah, for you? Because it's frozen for me.
Oh, it just advanced. Yeah, it was frozen for me for a second too.
There we go. All right. And it was denied. So to the furor of a lot of wolverine biologists, and to the public. In Canada, it's a little bit quieter here. Wolverines are listed as special concern, which is that bin that COSEWIC puts things in when they think there might be a problem, but not really sure. They don't think it's in trouble enough to be threatened or endangered, and so they know they need to do something, but they're not sure what. Basically, being glib, I'm on the COSEWIC committee, but that's where it sits. So we know there's an issue, but we're not really sure what to do about it. So the question then remains, so what do we actually know about wolverines right now, and how can this knowledge inform conservation? These were our two goals. So the first thing we have to do, before we get into wolverine conservation, we really have to understand the biology of the animal. And I thought I knew a lot about the biology of the animal, but this deep dive into these 150 research papers taught me a lot. First of all, it's been modeled that wolverines have really high metabolic demands. It's been modeled that they require about 1,200 calories per day, which is basically the equivalent of 2 big giant cheeseburgers and fries to go along with it. And those are fairly rare commodities out in the tundra and up in mountain environments. And so wolverines, instead, they get that calories from small things, especially in the summertime, basically whatever they can catch. Small mammals, rodents, snowshoe hares, ptarmigan, and other birds. Marmots are a really big one. But they'll also eat big things as well. So in the Arctic, they're known to actually chase down and hunt live caribou. They also eat moose and sheep, usually as dead things, because their role is of a facultative scavenger. So they'll take basically whatever food they can find when they can get it. They need to power this engine that they have because wolverines make a living by moving constantly. They move straight up mountain ranges and down the other side. They patrol vast home ranges, male home ranges around 1,000 square kilometers, females about half of that. So they're constantly on the move in cold, rugged environments, so they need a lot of food. And that food requirement is going to become important later. So wolverines, part 2 of their biology here is that they live at very low densities. So here in Canada, some recent research that we'll get to, they're sitting around 2 per 1,000 square kilometers. And that's in the prime best habitat that we have for wolverines. And that's in the mountains. We don't really know densities in the Arctic and in the boreal yet, but I don't think there's reason to suspect they're much more dense than that, except in a few places, like maybe in the Northwest. So wolverines, they live these reasonably solitary existences. Male territories don't really overlap that much. A male might overlap with a couple of females, but they widely range and they're low density. Now, like all things, wolverines need a place where they can give birth and have kits. And through this deep dive into literature, it's become clear that denning areas are pretty crucial for wolverines and apparently fairly problematic. So wolverines have a really, well, they're engineered to be a pretty stable population in that they don't produce a lot of kids and they don't produce them very often. So they breed on average, or they give birth on average every other year to on average 1 to 2 kits, and those kits have very low survival. So even under the best situations, population growth rates for wolverines are usually no more than 1.1. So this is not an eruptive species, nor is it something that's able to come back quickly if it takes a hit. And so these denning areas are pretty crucial. The kits are when the animals are most vulnerable. And a lot of research has dug into the importance of snow dens, pun intended. So because wolverines live usually where it's cold and they den in some of these amazing places like in root throws and under boulders that accumulate lots of snow, and they dig out these snow dens and avalanche chutes, and that's where they have their kits and raise them up. But that's going to become important later when we talk about the role of climate change. And kudos to fellow Wolverine researcher Doris for this amazing photograph. So as I suggested, Wolverines like it cold. So they're a circumboreal distribution, circumarctic. So this is from the Wolverine Foundation, this map. The dark areas are where wolverines are found all the way from Russia through China, Mongolia, and then Northern Europe, Fennoscandia, into Canada, Alaska, and a little bit into the lower 48. So this is a species that's evolved, we think, based on latest fossil research in the late Miocene and then heading into the early Pleistocene, but basically probably radiating most significantly during the Pleistocene when things were really cold. So this is a cold adapted species. So which countries are studying wolverines? This is one of the questions that we asked. We want to know where the majority of wolverine research was coming from and what kind of things people were studying in those regions and how people were studying wolverines. So in this graphic, you can see where that 156 papers we got are represented from across the map. So very little that we could find anyway. We definitely obviously have a English speaking bias in our search. But very little English language published literature coming from Russia, the Ukraine, and Germany. What there was usually fossil-based research. Some ecological research coming out of China, which was nice to see. Quite a bit coming out of Fennoscandia countries, with the lion's share coming out of the US and Canada. And people used a wide variety of techniques to cut this wolverine cake. And they studied a bunch of different things. So a lot of people studied natural processes. So how wolverines overlap in space. And as I suggested, they don't much. There's quite a bit of intraspecific territoriality amongst wolverines. They keep out of each other's way, and they keep each other out of their way. Probably because of that desire to get a lot of food off of food-limited land base. There was an increasing amount of research on landscape change and climate change, including the effects of snow and fragmentation, increasing body of literature on human activity and landscape change, and a lot of people still testing methods for studying wolverines. So for instance, there's recently been 3D accelerometers that were implanted into wolverines that have yielded brand new insights into the metabolics of wolverines and how they use energy. So a lot of really exciting research emanating from around the northern world. If you take this big body and you condense it down, especially with a focus on the stressors to wolverines, you come up with the three horsemen of the wolverine apocalypse. That's landscape change, climate change, and overharvest. And I'm going to talk about each of these things in turn. So, as I said before, Canada and USA lead in research publications in terms of the number of papers published, but we do not lead in conservation. So wolverines are taking quite a hit here in North America. Their range has contracted markedly in past centuries. This map is from the Kosiewicz 2003 report and the updated reports. The gray area there is historic range, which of course is somewhat uncertain based on museum records and a variety of other data sources, but we're pretty sure that we lost wolverine range from a significant part of northern North America. And in fact, some of the recent research that we uncovered is from the Maritimes and showed that yes, indeed, wolverines existed all the way through New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, but not into PEI. And that's based on harvest trapping records. So as late as the very late 1800s, early 1900s, there were wolverines through the Maritimes and through the Gaspésie and southern Quebec and southern Ontario, et cetera. So this is a pretty recent range contraction that coincides with European colonization. And we booted them pretty much out of the prairies, and now they live in the mountains in the Boreal and the Arctic. But we might lead in North America in terms of the number of publications, but Scandinavia really takes the prize in terms of long-term wolverine monitoring. And I knew that they had stuff going on, it was good stuff, but I didn't realize how extensive it was until we dug into this literature. So their long-term wolverine monitoring is based on snow tracking. So they'll go out and do snow track surveys, which they then backtrack to look for active den sites, which becomes important in a second. It's based on DNA data from the mandatory returns of dead animals from harvest and from culling, as well as an extensive non-invasive DNA hair collection program. So all of this information is popped into a centralized database called RoveBase, where a lot of really intricate and fascinating analyses have been done on it. Now, in Scandinavia, predator control and exploitation is the principal concern for wolverine. So, of course, historically, humans have had a pretty colored relationship with predators and have done a lot to persecute and prosecute them whenever they overlap. That's still ongoing in Scandinavia because a lot of wolverine range overlaps with reindeer herding areas of Sami pastoralists. And wolverines do a real number on caribou calves when they're very vulnerable. And so in the past, Sami and others and governments have predator controlled wolverines. And in a really cool and quite effective conservation program, the government flipped the script on livestock compensation. So instead of paying Sami for animals that were taken, they started to pay the Sami for active wolverine dens within the reindeer herding area. So again, this is where the snow tracking program comes to account, which involves the Sami and the government. So they would do snow tracking, they would find, backtrack to dens, they would confirm that this is an active reproductive wolverine den. For every one of those found, they would pay the Sami for it. And so it becomes a source of income for them, and it's something that they want to encourage rather than want to engage in predator control. And this has had tremendous uptake, and it's also resulted in a stabilization of that wolverine decline that we've seen. How we know it's led to the stabilization is by, in my opinion, one of the coolest pieces of research we uncovered in this deep dive by a paper by Richard Bischoff and others. This is the title of it, and I think it really contains something that we need to learn from the Scandinavians because it is an amazing piece of work. And here's how it goes. This is from the paper, their conceptual model. So they get dead recovery data. So whenever an animal is culled and there's a mortality, that gets pulled into RoveBase. DNA is taken from that animal. There's also genetic sampling data from non-invasive genetic surveys all across the region. And they also pull in spatial and temporal data from GIS spatial coverage layers. And they use all this data to build an open population spatial capture recapture model. So basically what they do is that they model density as well as population parameters such as recruitment and mortality and survival from year to year to year to year because they have this long-term monitoring data set and they can do that. And then from this OPSCR model, they can estimate density and population size and space use, survival and recruitment, and use that to forecast density and population size. What they found from this work is that upon the introduction of this compensation program, Wolverines populations indeed started to stabilize. So they were on a long-term decline, and then they leveled off, and they're still staying relatively level. And that's manifested not only in the estimated number of Wolverines, but also in the spatial coverage of Wolverines, the space use. You can see has increased steadily from 2013 to 2019. And in fact, we're actually seeing Wolverine recovery and recolonization because that population has gone from being a sink to a source, and Wolverines are now starting to come south and recolonize the boreal areas of Scandinavia they haven't been in for a couple of centuries. So it's a tremendous success story, both in terms of the conservation they've applied, but also in the science they've used to understand how that conservation has worked. They're able to forecast into the future. So this is the forecast model that they built. If they allow twice the amount of average culling mortality that they've seen, which is that, I don't know what color that is, but brownish, it's the one on the far right, we can expect to see a decrease in the Wolverine trajectory. Whereas if they carry on, we'll see a stabilization. If they can reduce that culling mortality even more, they expect to see an increase in that population further. And so hopefully more recolonization of some of those lost areas. So we can really take a page from that because the unfortunate reality is that overharvest is occurring here, at least in the southern Canadian range. And so some really great research by some colleagues here in Alberta, in BC, made use of an extensive DNA and camera-based data set across Banff, Kootenay, Yoho National Park, the Flathead, Waterton Park, and surrounding areas, and used again, the spatial capture-recapture models to estimate densities, and then modeled that against known harvest rates. And what they found is that in southeast BC, the harvest rate, the current harvest rate, is well above what can be handled. So the red zone there is over harvest. The pink it's getting pretty dodgy. Below that, the white area in that graph is pretty comfortable. You can see southeast BC is way up into the red zone. Southwest Alberta is reasonably safe, but that's only because the only place in Southwest Alberta they got data from was Waterton National Park, where there is no trapping. And then the whole area combined, again, is in the red zone. And so there's pretty intensive trapping occurring there, well beyond what can be sustained. And so this is a really nice piece, I think, of catch up to the Scandinavians and seeing what we can glean from DNA data and what that kind of data can tell us about the effect of harvesting. And I want to make it really clear, since Bill and others are on this call, I am not anti-trapping. I fully respect the legacy of that. Just like everything else, it needs to be done right. We need a lot better information on the effect that trapping and other activities are having on wolverines, so we can make effective conservation decisions like the Scandinavians are. So the lessons on wolverine harvest. Canada and the US are pretty much 2 decades behind Scandinavia in understanding the effects of harvest on populations. Overharvest is real in the places we have looked hard for it. We don't have really good data on harvest in the boreal forest, and there are some harvest programs in the Arctic, and they're starting to publish on that, where they're collecting harvest data from trappers and associated with trappers. And it's that trapper involvement that just made that whole program possible. We're really looking forward to that information coming out, because then we'll have the ability to compare between different populations and landscapes. But ultimately, really, Canada's lack of a long-term monitoring program is a massive shortcoming that needs remedying. And the US was in that boat as well until a couple of years ago, when a bunch of the Western states got together and formed a multi-state Western wolverine monitoring program that is now in its, I think, 3rd, 4th year and continuing to roll out. That's really resetting the agenda about wolverines in the States. So that's harvesting. Let's talk about the second horseman here, and that's landscape change. So we know that landscapes are changing across the West. There's always been forest harvesting, of course, but that continues unabated. There is petro development that creates this crazy patchwork of seismic lines and well sites and pipelines and access roads and et cetera, that have really transformed the landscape into something that we've never seen before. Wolverines have never had to contend with before. So here's an aerial view of the Alberta foothills. You can see it's pretty carved up all the way right up into the rock. In GIS, we can see it. That's the linear feature density in brown. I made that baby poop brown color on purpose. You can see that those seismic lines, they really push right up into the rock and pushing right into wolverine habitat, butting up against the national parks and protected areas. And so in that provincial land base in the boreal forest and the foothills is really taking a hammering from landscape change. So what does that mean for wolverines? Well, research that's been done here in Alberta has shown pretty conclusively that wolverine occurrence really sharply decreases with linear feature density. So you can see that curve there on the left. If you've got in places where there's a low proportion of linear features, so down to none, so the protected areas, you're pretty assured of getting a wolverine in a territory, but you jump that up to 1.5%, going on to 2, and that plummets. And then you get to 3%, a mere 3% of the landscape in linear features, and you're ending up with no wolverines. And that's a pretty big effect. And it's not just here in Alberta that's found. A whole bunch of research done by Mark Boyce and crew and his student Matt Scrafford, and then Andrea Doris, Garth, et cetera, in BC, And then folks in Norway as well have all found the same thing, that the landscape footprint, that human infrastructure is no bueno for wolverines. So the question is why? So it could be because wolverines just don't like us. Maybe they don't like stinky humans. Maybe they don't like the looks of our faces. Maybe we're too loud. Those things are probably all true, verifiably true, I would say. It could be that the habitat is lost, in air quotes, but wolverines really have no problem crossing seismic lines. They have a problem crossing highways, but all the smaller linear features, not so much. And in fact, Matt and Mark show that they actually use cut blocks. So what's going on? And we think that part of the problem lies in the fact that everyone wants your food when you're a wolverine. So you got to contend with big things in the summertime, like these dodgy looking black bears, and there's grizzly bears in the landscape too, much bigger than you, or after all the same food resources you are. You got to contend with wolves. Wolves are kind of a double-edged sword because wolverines are suspected to follow wolf packs around and scavenge their kills, but wolves also kill wolverines. They also kill the things that wolverines would otherwise eat, and so they're a competitor for wolverines. And so they've got this love-hate relationship, I think. And then all through the winter, they got to deal with those wolves. They have to deal with cougars taking their food. They got to deal with small little things too, the coyotes and foxes coming and stealing their stuff. And if you're trying to get 1,200 calories a day while roaming a landscape, you're the only wolverine roaming a landscape 1,000 square kilometers. That's a lot of other things coming to take your food. And so competition is probably, we think, relatively stiff. So we asked this question in Banff National Park, K Country, and the Wilmore Wilderness. Oh, pardon me, not Banff, but K Country and the Wilmore Wilderness, where we modeled wolverine occurrence with coyote occurrence and the presence of linear features. And what we found is that wolverines were 3 times more likely to co-occur with coyotes in the presence of linear features. So coyotes are anthrophilic. They really like to follow humans around. They take great advantage of the early cereal vegetation that we create and the disturbance we create. So more linear feature footprint brings in more wolverines, puts them in contact, brings in more coyotes, puts them in contact with wolverines. We think that's part of the big problem with this human footprint. And in fact, the places where you got wolverine only is places where you just didn't get linear features, which is really, really telling. So that's some new research that just came out. And more research is popping up around those species interactions. So lessons on climate change. America's last wolverine populations up in the mountains, they're pretty highly fragmented. So a lot of research that we found was dealing with understanding the degree to that fragmentation. Wolverines basically exist in these little mountaintop pockets. And so how do they get from mountaintop to mountaintop, right? They got to go through valley bottoms, which are highly developed. They're really poor wolverine habitat. There's a lot of things down there that can kill them, not a lot of things they can eat. So that fragmentation is really a big problem. But it's not just them. Canada's boreal mountain populations are increasingly threatened by development as well. And this is not being addressed. This is a huge threat for wolverines that is currently not on the radar for landscape management or for wolverine conservation. And we think that's a huge problem. So the third horseman of the apocalypse, and that's climate change. I love this photo set. This is from the Mountain Legacy Project on the left. This is an old surveyor's photo from the turn of the century, the last century, where they went through the mountains and they took these photos of the mountains. The Mountain Legacy Project seeks to go and recreate all these photographs. So here's that same landscape recreated now. So you can see this massive glacial retreat, and everybody in Alberta is familiar with this and having to walk that long stretch to get into the glacier where you didn't have to when you were a kid. But this is just an exemplar of what's happening globally, right? And especially in mountain environments. And of course, the Arctic is warming even faster than the global rate. So the world is getting hotter, and a lot of that cold is going away. And dozens of papers that we looked at highlight the importance of snow to wolverines. So this is true in the Palearctic as well. It's less on their radar in Scandinavia because they're dealing with their predator control problem. But still, there's a lot of work that's been showed that snow is important there, and it's the focus of ongoing research as well. A lot of work out of the States has shown that snow is important, and what we found in Alberta and folks in BC have shown is that all have shown that snow is pretty important for wolverines. Why it's important, we're not really sure. It could be that denning issue. It could be that snow makes life really hard for competitors like coyotes and things like that to come and take their food, and so it gives wolverines that competitive advantage. It could be all of the above. But so for a whole bunch of reasons, snow, they set the board so that wolverines can win the chess game. And if you have less snow, you got less chance that wolverines are going to win. So of course, south of the boreal forest, mountains, for reasons of landscape and climate change, are some of the last bastions for wolverines, which means that connectivity in the mountains is absolutely crucial. Forecast modeling suggests that that snow layer is going to push to the north and it's going to push to the west. And so Arctic and mountains are going to become increasingly important. We're going to probably lose more habitat to climate change as the globe continues to warm. So more bad news for wolverines. What does that mean? Well, a great place to look is obviously the lower 48, because that's where climate change is hitting the hardest. It's already much warmer than ours, and their relic wolverine population exists only in mountain ranges in those western states. So in a really elegant, cool piece of research, my colleague Kathleen Carroll and her collaborators did a bunch of modeling to test landscape resistance and connectivity for wolves for wolverines in the western US. And so what they came up with is a series of scenarios where resistance gets increasingly worse as you go to the upper left. So in the F scenario, connectivity is reasonably okay, and then it diminishes as you go from F through to A. So A being sort of the worst case scenario. So you can see how diminishing connectivity and increasing resistance, which is the difficulty wolverines have getting through that landscape because of mortality and whatnot, even a little bit has the effect of making life a lot harder for wolverines, reducing those available habitats, reducing those populations, breaking up what we call metapopulation connectivity, the ability of groups of wolverines to find each other and exchange genes, which is vital to the continuing of population. And so the forecast for them isn't great. What Kathleen and others have shown is that climate change planning, it's really about connectivity planning, and that we have to start with landscape management now that future-proofs that landscape for wolverines. One of the other things we found is that especially in the Nearctic, is that there's a lot of research on protected areas, and protected areas are vital to wolverine conservation because that land is set aside from that industrial development that takes such a hard toll. Typically, they are not harvested, and so they don't have the opportunity to be over-harvested, right? Over-harvesting doesn't occur everywhere that there's harvesting, but need harvesting for it to be over-harvested. So if you have these protected areas that retain source populations for wolverines, that's good. But protected areas face challenges too. As the human population increases, we get more wealth. There's increasing pressure on protected areas for recreation, right? Look what happened whenever Alberta parks shut down and everybody flooded into the Bighorn, and it was hard to find a place to pitch a tent in there. It's wonderful because so many people want to connect with nature, but they're connecting with the same places that wolverine rely on. And so what does that do to wolverines? Some really cool research out of the States by Kim Heinemeyer and colleagues showed that even skiing, backcountry skiing, can lead to indirect habitat loss and some negative functional responses to backcountry recreation. And Marian Barretto and colleagues are doing some research on similar things in BC, Alberta. And of course, parks have to be serviced by transportation corridors. You know, the most famous of one is the Trans-Canada Highway, which bisects Banff National Park. And really great research by Mike Sawaya and colleagues has took a look at non-invasively sampled DNA from across Banff and showed that differences in female haplotypes north and south of that transportation corridor suggest that that highway really is demographically fragmenting that population, that females aren't just making it across. And so that's one more thing that we have to manage in protected areas and elsewhere. So based on these 156 papers, we put all this information together and we pulled out the main points. We put it all together into this life cycle of a Wolverine figure. And it starts off with a happy pregnant female. As an aside, for those of you who don't know, Wolverines have a really cool adaptation to a very low density, lonely, solitary existence, in that they have delayed implantation. So, of course, you don't want to be giving birth to young any old time of the year. You want to time that seasonally so you can have them in the winter snow caves. But you never know when you're going to run across a good-looking fellow when you're traveling around that 500 square kilometer home range of yours. So if you find a handsome fellow at a weird time of year, love strikes, and you mate, that egg becomes fertilized, but it doesn't actually implant in the uterine wall until the fall time, when it implants, and that way it can start to grow. The Wolverine can go into the snow den and then give birth to those young under the proper circumstances. So presuming that they have appropriate structure for denning, then they undergo parturition or give birth to 1 or 2 kits. And then they have the challenge of rearing those kits. And as I said before, those kits are incredibly vulnerable, very low survival rate, high mortality rate. You got to find enough food for those kits. So that includes the small things and scavenging the big things and competing with all those animals that would take that food from you. If you manage to raise those kids up and recruit them into the population as young adults, then those young adults have to go make their way in the world. They too have to find food. They have to find protection from human disturbance and make sure they don't get over harvested. If they make it and they persist, they become adults. That adults start to contribute to the breeding population. Here is where population connectivity becomes vital, right? So those young adults, they're dispersing off, and hopefully they disperse into good places. But I'm sure that you might have heard stories about Wolverine found in what was my favorite one? It was in a sandbox in St. Albert. I was hating that family so bad. I've been researching Wolverines forever, and I still haven't seen one in the wild except on camera. And these guys get up in the morning coffee, and there's a Wolverine playing in their sandbox. Jake was not happy. Well, I'm sort of happy for them, I guess. There was also tale of Wolverines heading down the Bow River drainage off to Medicine Hat, etc. So there have been Wolverines seen dispersing off into the prairies, never to be seen again. So these are sink events, we think, that are draining off the source population. These animals really need to get to other places where they can meet other Wolverines, set up their home range, mate, and then start the whole breeding cycle all over again. And so there's a myriad of threats that they have to face in order to make that happen. And currently, unfortunately, in both the Palearctic and the Nearctic, those things aren't really being met. Now, keep in mind that these things are really low density, okay? So at their best of 2 Wolverines per 1,000 square kilometers, a very tiny, I think most would say non-viable population of 30 Wolverines spans 15,000 square kilometers. In other words, that's about half of Belgium, right? If you actually talk about the kinds of numbers that population viability analyses kick around, like 100 Wolverines, you're basically talking about a massive area that this population has to navigate and deal with these threats. So wrapping it all up and together, what have we learned? What lessons have we taken from the Wolverine? Wolverines have evolved for very solitary lives in cold environments. Humans, unfortunately, are not friends to the Wolverine. We often kill too many Wolverines, either on purpose for predator control or accidentally because we overharvested them due to lack of information on population trajectories. We mess up their landscapes, either directly or by bringing in uninvited guests that make life hard for them and steal their stuff. We make life too hot by heating up the atmosphere and melting all that snow upon which they rely. We research Wolverines a lot lately, which is great. The amount we know about Wolverine biology and ecology and conservation now is in a different orbit from what it was 20 years ago. But we monitor wolverines far too little. So these research projects, at least in the near Arctic, are isolated one-offs, and there isn't a cohesive, comprehensive wolverine monitoring program. Or at least there wasn't until the States started theirs. There's nothing like that in Canada, and we monitored far too little. And unfortunately, we conserve wolverines even less. So the petition to be listed on the Endangered Species Act was declined. There's going to be another run at it. Who knows what's going to happen? Is Canada any closer to protecting wolverines federally? Maybe not. Are they protected in BC and Alberta? Well, that has yet to be determined. So all this information is all wrapped up together in the paper that we put out, and it's available freely online. Wolverines in a Changing Landscape and Warming Climate, Decadal Synthesis of Global Conservation Ecology Research. You can get it and dig into it yourselves. This was a supreme team effort that sprung out of a Wolverine workshop put on by Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, and a whole bunch of people worked on it and lended their advice. And so we're pretty confident and proud of what we came up with, but also I think kind of dismayed by the big gaps that remain, not so much in our knowledge of wolverines. We get a pretty good sense of what's going on with their ecology, but in the fact that we are so data deficient in their monitoring their population trajectories, and it's something that we really have to tackle. So with that, I'll thank the sponsors and thank you, and I guess open it up to questions.
That was great, Jake. Thank you so much. Just gonna stop your screen share so people get a bigger vision of your beautiful face. So we do have a few questions in the Q&A, which I will start asking, and I'll just remind people that if they would like to ask Jake some questions about the enigmatic wolverine, then they can put their questions in the Q&A or in the chat. So I'll start off, Jake. Somebody would like to know what accounts for high wolverine infant mortality?
Oh, fantastic question. That's a really hard, it's fantastic because that's really hard to answer. When we go to study wolverine mortality, it's usually done by radio collaring, right? Or satellite collaring, which we do to adults. And so when we make inferences about the kit mortality, it's because we've collared a female that had some kits and then suddenly she doesn't have a kit anymore. And so it's hard to say what accounts for it. Definitely they get predated. There was a really good piece of research out of BC that shows that wolverines in general often get predated quite a bit by other bigger carnivores, which is kind of surprising. So I don't doubt that the kits are probably in that same situation, but we really don't know a lot about it. We only know that when we see wolverines, females with kits, we often see them without those kits later on, in which we have to infer that mortality. But it's a data gap for sure. So great question.
Yeah, it's a good question. Do they live north of tree line?
Oh yeah, absolutely they do. So they span the Arctic, so they go north of the boreal forest right into the tundra, all the way up to the Arctic Circle. They've been seen out in the Arctic pack ice. And so in the mountains, they often go north of tree line and hang out up there quite a bit. Interesting piece of wolverine behavior. One of the things that they do is they'll climb to the top of a ridge line well above tree line, and they'll perch themselves up there for whenever the sun comes up and it starts to warm the land, and the smell is brought up and rises with the rising heat, and so they can smell where scavenging opportunities are, and then they'll make their way down to those scavenging opportunities.
Oh my God.
So they're all over the place.
That's one of the coolest things I've ever heard. I love that. They just like go up there, they have their little morning coffee, their little morning meditation, and then they're just like, oh, over there, I can smell that thing, I'm gonna go get it. They're out on the pack ice. Like, what are they eating out on the pack ice? Like, what is there?
I don't know. I mean, that's pretty
anecdotal. Polar bears
anecdotal.
And seals.
Yeah, I don't know. That's pretty anecdotal. I mean, Wolverines just go some pretty crazy places and do crazy
Yeah.
things. Wolverines. I got this photo. I was actually going to use it here, but it gives me so much grief. It's a Wolverine at a processing station in the oil sands, like in the mine. So, you know, you can see the great big conveyor belts and the great big trucks rolling,
Yeah.
and in the background, and there's this Wolverine perched majestically on this processor station looking at the trucks coming by. And when I was doing this research originally, it kept getting sent to me by a whole bunch of well-meaning folks, I think, in the oil and gas industry saying, Wolverines love Alberta oil. Like, yeah, cool. I guess
That's awesome.
Anyway. So who knows what they're doing
any
out there.
opportunity. Any opportunity. That's fantastic. Do you know how often Wolverines hunt boreal caribou?
Oh, fantastic question. So a lot of the hunting that I've seen pictures of and I've heard from colleagues happens up in the Arctic, where they will run down small herds of caribou and they'll just run them down for hours. They'll just run and run and run and run until the caribou are too tired, and then the Wolverines will jump on their legs, they'll hamstring them so that the animal falls down, and then they'll tear out their throats and then eat them. I don't know how often that happens in the boreal because it's a pretty different environment, not really made for chasing down a caribou for hours. It's pretty dangly there. We do know from research that was done at UNBC that Wolverines are a not insignificant predator of caribou neonates. So caribou calves, newborns and young calves, and that they'll take quite a few of them. And so it's one of the predators that we think we're gonna have to manage for caribou survival. But to my knowledge, that's pretty limited information too.
But if they're operating at such a low density, like, are they actually impacting caribou populations?
It's hard to imagine that they are.
Yeah. Do Wolverines use wildlife under and overpasses? And this is kind of a question I was having too, is when you talk about connectivity and managing for connectivity for Wolverines, like, connectivity can mean a lot of things. It's not just a highway crossing structures. And so when you're talking about connectivity for Wolverines, what does that mean? Like, what should management plans look like that are managing for connectivity for Wolverines?
That's an amazing question too. I'll tackle the over underpasses part first. There's people on this call who can answer that question far better than I. So Tony Clevenger and Mike Sawaya and others, bunch of people in Banff National Park have been monitoring wildlife use of those overpasses for a number of years. What they've shown is that Wolverines have been shown to use those overpasses, but of course they exist in such small densities that hitting on one at the right place at the right time is pretty rare. So if they have like four, I don't know how many observations they got of Wolverines using overpasses, but say you've got 4, well, what does that mean, right? Like, so is it that all of them are using it? That's the point, I think, of the genetic research, which showed that, hey, even though, you know, these overpasses are in place, there's still this demographic fragmentation. And so we think Wolverines, female Wolverines at least, probably aren't transiting and using those overpasses as much as we hope that they would. So whether that's a really effective tool for increasing connectivity is hard to say. I certainly think it's better than not having overpasses. There's no question of that.
Sure.
And in terms of connectivity planning, wow, I mean, that's a mouthful, right? I mean, how do you create a corridor for Wolverines that they'll use and that provides safe passage to other parts of the meta population? These are all really great questions that I think require a lot of minds to get together an answer. I don't have the answer off the top of my head for sure.
Yeah, that's okay. It's a tough one, but
Yeah,
I think it kind of comes back to the need for landscape scale planning. And you're talking about an animal that exists at pretty low densities, has a connectivity related issues. And if we want to conserve Wolverines, we've got to consider connectivity. And that inherently means that we require large landscape level planning and management that thinks much larger than just the site scale.
Absolutely.
How long, Cindy Kemper would like to know, how long do you think we would need consistent monitoring to get enough data to support a status evaluation of wolverines in Alberta?
Cindy, I think we have enough information to do a status evaluation now. I think status in the sense, like, what is the snapshot that wolverines are doing now? I think if we could get Matt Scrafford to do density analysis on his boreal data, and if we could pile in all the wolverine data we've collected on the Alberta mountain land base into a density analysis, we'd have a reasonable snapshot of what wolverine densities are like in both the boreal and mountain regions now. We just haven't tackled it. In terms of how long do we need to monitor to say something about population trends, I would say that if we did it consistently over the next 5 years, we could put together a 5-year snapshot, I think, with existing technologies that would give us reasonable confidence to say if that population is declining or increasing. And that's based on the kind of variability that Scandinavia saw in their data, right? Where they could make a pretty reasonable conclusion based on 5 years of data, stretching out, of course, into that 10 for that forecast. But I do firmly believe we have enough information to reassess the status of wolverines in Alberta now.
Yeah, that's well, that's a really interesting point. I feel like we could talk about just that idea for another 20 minutes. Do you know if there are wolverine sources and sinks? Like, you know, there's a really great model of grizzly bear habitat use in Alberta that is like, bears are born here, bears die here. And like that sources and sinks model of Scott Nielsen's has been really helpful in a lot of management. Is there something similar for wolverines?
Yeah, no. I mean, the amount of research and resources that have gone into wolverines is fractional compared to bears. You know, we're talking several orders of magnitude difference, right? A lot of wolverine research is funded by NGOs, and if it wasn't for them, it probably wouldn't get done. Supported by organizations, other NGOs like the Trappers Association, etc. But in terms of like, okay, we're a government, here's $2 million a year over the next 10 years to figure what's going on with wolverines, that hasn't happened. And so we can't really say what's the source, what's the sink. I can say that based on the space use data from wolverines that have been collected in, let's say, the Wilmore Wilderness, there's 26. Whenever I looked back in the day, there was 26 wolverines in there, and that space use was pretty full. There wasn't like a lot of places in there where wolverines weren't, which meant that if there's new young that are trying to make their way in the world, they'd have to leave. And so I guess you could consider that leaving individual would be from a source. Now, whether it goes into a sink or not depends on whether it leaves and finds good habitat elsewhere where it can set up a home range. If you're moving into the east, definitely not. You're disappearing into Never Never Land because there's no wolverines there. If you move north, or then you probably have a pretty good chance. If you move west, there's a lot of competition, but there's more space. If you move south, then, which we know that there's north-south migration between American and Canadian wolverines, then you're really rolling the dice, right? And so I think it's a very complex source-sink relationship, but these are all hypotheses really at this point. Yeah, no, it's really interesting to kind of think about what would be required, and that's our next question here is, like, what, in your opinion, what is the key data gaps for wolverines within the boreal that should be tackled first? Like you say, we know enough to do a status assessment, but there's still so many data gaps. So, like, how do we prioritize that? Wow, I think getting a handle on wolverine population size should be our #1 priority. And so understanding density better. Given that direct mortality through harvest is the thing that we can, I think, manage most effectively and most proximately. And I think, I really hope anyway, that the ATA who are involved in harvesting wolverine will be fully on board with such a thing, because they want that resource to be available for their children and grandchildren to enjoy that legacy activity. and don't want to be in a place where they're taking more than they can, right? And of course, they're also dealing with the effects of landscape change and climate change on wolverines too. And so I think that getting that density info and understanding the population trajectory is absolutely paramount. That's paramount for provincial protection, for federal protection, and management in both of those levels. So I would say that's the #1 priority.
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to do one last question here because it's 8:59, even though I feel like I could talk to you about wolverines all night long. But from Courtney, being the human dimensions person that she is, in your view of the literature, what have you found relative to human values, knowledge, and behavior towards wolverines and their conservation? Maybe aside from trappers, not that they're not important. And I'm curious to know if there was greater awareness about these elusive animals, we could build a stewardship value and move the needle on conservation action.
Yeah, fantastic question. So there's been a bunch of social values work done in the Palearctic around wolverines in an attempt to get consensus for that predator compensation program. Wolverines, we're pretty, it's kind of what you'd expect, right? That the people who live with wolverines are often pretty realistic about what they represent in terms of the loss to their livelihoods and the trouble busting into your cabin and chewing up all your stuff. Whereas people in the cities are either like, meh, what's a wolverine? I get that question all the time still. And fair enough, right? I mean, if you've never seen one, how would you know what it is? To those people who know what it is, but I think it's great and we really need to keep them around. So it really just runs the gamut of human experience. Very little research done in the Arctic. There's some really cool work we found just published in 2020 by Bonamy out in Quebec, who looked at attitudes of urban people in the south, so city dwellers in the south of Canada versus Arctic peoples, and how they differentially viewed wolverines. Kind of falls out amongst the same lines, and so it's really interesting. So I think that groundwork is there, and really good work that's done by Nathan Cardinal, who gathered up a whole lot of traditional knowledge from First Nations and Indigenous communities about wolverines, and so I think we have a good base to start something like that.
Yeah, it's so neat because we just, I mean, we could know so much more, and if we had unlimited funds and unlimited time, we could definitely know a lot more.
Yeah, we could. I just want to put this final plug in though, Sarah, is that I think we often fall back on, well, we just don't know enough. We can't move the needle on this. We can't reassess them. We don't know enough. We can't conserve them. We don't know enough. And I'm going to take my soapbox forum here to call BS on that. This paper has shown we know more than enough to start treating this thing a whole lot more seriously as a conservation issue that we have, and it's time to start getting it done. Yeah,
I agree. I think a lot of times in conservation, we have enough data to take action, and that's really the whole purpose of adaptive management. Is to take action with the knowledge that you have and be willing to adapt it as you learn more over time. And I think the wolverines really present themselves to adaptive management quite classically, right? So I want to thank you very much, Jake, for your presentation. It was amazing. I know John has a few closing remarks, but just before I turn the mic back over to John, I just want to thank everybody for coming and let you know that if you didn't win anything in the live auction, fear not, because our online auction is live and happening and has amazing prizes. I just threw the link in the chat there. And also, we are a nonprofit organization that really relies on the generous support of donors and members to keep our operations going. So if you enjoyed tonight's webinar and you feel like it was worth $10, I'm going to stick a link in the chat, and if you could donate $10 to the Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society, we would be eternally grateful. This is our conference webinar, but we do run webinars throughout the year that are also open publicly and share the most recent science about wildlife research and conservation in Alberta. And with that, I'll just turn it over to John for closing remarks.
Yeah, just a final word to say thanks again, Jake, for coming out. That was a fascinating talk. What an amazing assembly of information, and inspiring and informative. Thanks so much. I know some of the people here tonight are heading for tomorrow's conference or the Alberta Chapter of the Wildlife Society conference. So we'll look forward to seeing you there. And yeah, thanks to everyone who came out tonight and to our sponsor, the Alberta Trappers Association.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Take care. Goodbye.
Hi, everybody. Thanks. Bye-bye now.
Right.
Okay, I'm gonna close it off then.
See you in the morning.
Yes.